They gave her a crown shrouded in mourning. Not long after arriving in Spain, Maria Christina of Austria stood before a nation that did not love her, next to a man who barely knew her, under a sky still grieving another queen. Her veil, white and pristine, masked a truth she could not utter aloud. She had come not to become a queen in joy, but a placeholder for memory, a silent figure placed to stabilize a wounded kingdom and a fractured heart. And before her wedding night was over, she would understand the cost of loyalty to a throne not yet hers. She had been born into obedience. The Habsburg court in which Maria Christina was raised taught its daughters how to walk like statues, pray like monks, and listen like saints. Her mother, Archduchess Elizabeth Franziska, had prepared her for duty, not love. At 16, Maria Christina already read Latin, spoke French, and could sit in absolute stillness for hours during court ceremonies. An accomplishment the men around her called grace, though it was more accurately a survival mechanism. Love was something she read in poetry. Power was something one wore like gloves, tight, warm, and always hiding something beneath. In the early months of 1878, when the envoys arrived from Madrid, her fate was sealed with diplomatic phrasing and a silver tray of contracts. King Alfonso XII, young and twice her cousin, had lost his beloved wife Mercedes to typhoid just 5 months after their wedding. Spain, still trembling from decades of political chaos, could not afford a grieving monarch with no heir. Alfonso needed a new queen, not one who stirred passion, one who embodied continuity, stability, fertility. Maria Christina, royal, devout, discreet, fit the mold exactly. She said yes without smiling. It was not expected of her. When she crossed into Spain, the sky above the Pyrenees turned from bright winter light to the low gray smudge of Castilian haze. In Madrid, carriages bore wreaths of both celebration and remembrance. Crowds watched her procession in near silence, holding portraits of Queen Mercedes against their chests like saints. Behind closed balconies, whispers grew thick, too pale, too serious, too Austrian. The nobility watched not to welcome, but to measure. The press, still cautious after years of regime change, printed her full name, Maria Christina de Habsburgo-Lorena, like a warning label. The wedding took place on a cold November morning. Inside the royal chapel, gold dripped from every surface, but it could not hide the scent of wax and dust that clung to the wooden pews. Alfonso stood stiffly at the altar, a man molded by loss, etched in bone, with a grief he refused to shed. His dark eyes did not look at her as he took her hand. He looked past her, beyond her, towards something no living woman could provide. The ceremony ended not with joy, but with duty fulfilled. A queen installed, a contract ratified, a monarchy reinforced. The palace at El Pardo became her new world, a fortress of etiquette and unspoken rules. Her chambers were adorned with Spanish tapestries and Habsburg relics shipped from Vienna, as if to stitch two empires together by force. But nothing softened the silence between her and her husband. Their dinners were quiet, the walks brief, and when they spoke, it was in formal Spanish, never the shared German of their ancestry. Mercedes haunted every hallway. Her portrait still hung in Alfonso's private study. Her name was never spoken aloud, but it echoed in the tilt of his head, the way he lingered in silence, the way he did not touch Maria Christina unless ceremony demanded it. In public, they played their roles flawlessly. Alfonso appeared with her on balconies, offered her gloved hand to ministers, and praised her in formal addresses. Behind closed doors, he withdrew into his work, obsessed with restoring Spain's legitimacy. The nation had suffered humiliation, civil wars, foreign intervention, a failed republic. Alfonso sought redemption not just for himself, but for the entire Bourbon legacy. His desk became an altar to reform, constitutional drafts, military orders, diplomatic cables. Maria Christina watched from the edge, never intruding, but she listened. She learned. What the court did not see, she did. The tremor in his hands after long meetings. The bursts of coughing in the early hours. The blood on his handkerchief that he burned in the fireplace, pretending she hadn't noticed. Tuberculosis was a whispered death, A royal diagnosis meant scandal, uncertainty, and potential collapse. So he told no one, not even her. But she knew. She had seen death before. In Vienna, in her aunts, her cousins, the slow Habsburg decline. Death had a rhythm. And Alfonso had begun to move to its tempo. Maria Christina had no illusions about love, but she understood sacrifice. So she gave him what he needed: space, obedience, calm. While the court schemed and gossiped, she remained still. It was in her stillness that she found power. She began attending council meetings, not to speak, but to observe. She memorized names, affiliations, rivalries. She understood the fragile balance between the conservatives and liberals, the generals and bishops, the whispering Carlists who still dreamed of dethroning Alfonso and replacing him with a purer, more traditional king. She knew Spain did not love her, but it needed her. By the end of their first year of marriage, Maria Christina had transformed herself into something few expected: indispensable. When Alfonso traveled, she presided over functions. When riots threatened in Valencia, she wrote discreet letters to regional commanders, ensuring reinforcements moved without fanfare. She wore black often, not just in mourning of Mercedes, but to signal continuity with a grieving people. Her silence became not an absence, but a presence. In a country exhausted by rhetoric and violence, her restraint was mistaken for wisdom. She let them believe it. Still, Alfonso remained distant. Occasionally, on quiet nights, he would watch her from the doorway, expression unreadable, almost grateful, yet unable to cross the threshold into intimacy. There was a night, unspoken, unrecorded, when he sat beside her, coughing quietly, and took her hand in the dark. He didn't speak. Neither did she. That was the closest they came to tenderness, and it was enough. When the doctors finally confirmed her pregnancy, the announcement was wrapped in gold-embossed declarations, bells rung across Madrid, and processions held from Cadiz to Catalonia. Alfonso smiled in public for the first time in months. The monarchy, for the moment, felt eternal again. Spain exhaled, but Maria Christina knew better. She saw the blood on his collar, even as he kissed her hand. She heard the breathlessness when he climbed the staircase. The king was dying, and the child inside her was already a king in waiting. She did not cry. She could not. Queens do not weep when the empire watches, and so she lay awake at night, one hand resting on her stomach, the other tracing invisible prayers into the bedsheets. Outside the palace walls, Spain celebrated the renewal of its dynasty. Inside, a woman prayed for a man who would not see his son's face, for a crown that would pass too soon to too small a hand, and for the strength to carry it all in silence. Because Maria Christina of Austria had not come to Spain for love. She had come to outlive a ghost, bear a future, and wear the crown that death left behind. And the storm was only beginning. Grief has no shape, but it leaves behind shadows. Some so long they blur even the outlines of those still alive. For Maria Christina, the halls of El Pardo were filled not with echoes of her own footsteps, but with the ghost of a woman she had never known. Queen Mercedes, long gone in flesh, still reigned in portrait, in memory, in the collective yearning of a nation unwilling to let her go. And though Maria Christina now wore the crown, it sat not on her head, but beneath her, like ice beneath a skater, pristine and dangerous, ready to crack with one wrong move. She knew what the public thought, that she was the cold Austrian, the silent wife, the political bride. Mercedes had been everything she was not: young, Spanish, beloved. Her love story with Alfonso had been written in sunlight and tragedy, the kind of narrative that poets cling to. Maria Christina had arrived not as a chapter, but as an epilogue. And even as she carried the heir to the throne within her, she could feel how little space there was for her in the emotional landscape of Spain. Still, she did not retreat. In the routines of monarchy, she found structure. In its rituals, she found language. The Spanish court was both a theater and a minefield. She learned quickly who whispered, who watched, and who wielded true power. While Alfonso buried himself in matters of state, Maria Christina studied the court like a chessboard, silent, methodical, never allowing her emotions to cloud her understanding. She did not speak of Mercedes, but she absorbed her. She memorized the way Alfonso's tone shifted when others mentioned her name. She noticed which servants still lit candles near Mercedes' portrait. She saw the way the people laid flowers, not for their current queen, but for the one lost to fever. This wasn't jealousy, it was calculation. Maria Christina was not here to rival a memory. She was here to outlast it. Alfonso, for his part, remained a man divided. His political mind admired Maria Christina's discipline. Her Habsburg blood reassured the European courts. Her pregnancy gave legitimacy to his reign, but his heart remained locked behind a door he refused to reopen. Their conversations, when they happened, were framed by obligation: palace renovations, education policy, religious appointments. They shared meals without flavor, attended mass in the same pew, without ever exchanging a glance. But there were cracks, small, telling. One evening during a reception for foreign diplomats, a minor official made a careless remark comparing Maria Christina's demeanor to the brightness of Mercedes. Alfonso's jaw clenched, his response swift and cold. He corrected the man publicly, without raising his voice, but with enough ice to silence the room. That night, Maria Christina found fresh camellias, her favorite, placed in her chamber without a note. It was not affection, but it was awareness. And in a palace ruled by absence, that was something. Outside the palace, Spain remained restless. Though the monarchy had been restored, its foundations were still brittle. The Carlists, though defeated, continued to whisper of divine right and traditional succession. Republican radicals published pamphlets denouncing the crown, accusing the monarchy of being a foreign disease clinging to a Spanish body politic. The military was divided, the clergy restless, and the press increasingly bold. Alfonso responded with a blend of constitutional reform and authoritarian muscle. He balanced liberal concessions, like press laws and civil codes, with strict enforcement of order. But Maria Christina saw what others didn't. He was exhausting himself, burning his candle at both ends, trying to hold together a nation whose soul had been fractured by decades of war, revolution, and betrayal. She tried to help, not through confrontation, but through architecture. She built her influence slowly, through alliances with charitable institutions, by quietly funding orphanages, by appearing at hospitals and schools. She became, not by proclamation, but by perception, a queen of moral strength. Her image in the newspapers began to shift, from cold foreigner to dignified maternal figure. The people who once ignored her began to notice her stillness, not as detachment, but as grace. But she also made enemies. Within the court, her growing influence stirred resentment. Some nobles viewed her discretion as manipulation. Some bishops whispered that she was too close to liberal advisors. A cousin of Alfonso's, embittered by her access to the king, began to circulate rumors that Maria Christina had ambitions beyond the nursery, that she intended to control the boy to come and rule through him. Alfonso dismissed the gossip, but the court, like any hive of privilege, fed on venom as much as ceremony. Maria Christina learned to endure it. She had endured worse. In Vienna, she had watched uncles plot against one another over inheritance. She had seen how queens lost influence with one misstep, one scandal, one emotional outburst. So she offered none. Even as the court narrowed around her, she smiled softly, prayed publicly, and remained unshaken. Her dignity became her armor. And yet in private, she was not untouched. At night, alone in her chambers, she wrote letters she never sent. Letters to her mother, to God, even to Mercedes. She confessed her fears, her isolation, her sense that she was merely a bridge between a dead queen and an unborn king. She worried that Spain would never see her as anything more than a temporary solution, a necessary intermission before the next act. But she never allowed those fears to show, not once. As her pregnancy advanced, so did Alfonso's illness. He tried to hide it, cloaking his cough in laughter, avoiding medical appointments, insisting he was simply tired. But Maria Christina watched the color drain from his cheeks, the way his uniform sagged on shoulders once proud, the way his steps grew shorter, slower. She offered him herbal remedies passed down from her Habsburg grandmother. He accepted them with a nod but never used them. He was dying. She knew, and he knew that she knew. Still, They never said the words aloud. Instead, they moved around each other like constellations, close enough to see, never to touch. In the final weeks of the year, they appeared together more frequently. They attended concerts, visited charities, walked through the royal gardens. The court praised their unity, their devotion, but it was a carefully choreographed illusion, one both of them participated in, not to deceive the world, but to protect it from a truth it was not ready to face. And then came the night of the anniversary, a full year since their wedding. The palace hosted a quiet dinner, attended only by the inner circle. No grand speeches, no fanfare. Just silverware against porcelain. Candlelight against polished walls. Alfonso, thinner than ever, raised a glass in a toast. He looked at Maria Christina, not with love, but with a kind of reverence, like a soldier might look at the banner he carries into battle, knowing it will outlive him. That night he retired early. Maria Christina remained in the dining hall long after the guests had gone, staring at the empty chair beside her. She did not cry. She had long since run out of tears, but she did place her hand gently over her stomach and whispered, "You will not be born into peace, but you will be born into purpose." Outside, the bells of Madrid rang for the new year. Inside, the queen sat alone, cloaked in candlelight, haunted not just by a dead queen, but by a dying king. History would remember Alfonso XII as the restorer of monarchy, but the battle to preserve it, the battle no one saw, was already being fought in silence, by a woman the world had not yet learned how to see, and the child inside her had no idea that his mother's war had only just begun. The palace doors were still closed when the rumors began to leak. In whispers, behind church pews and market stalls, across Madrid's taverns and within government salons, the question festered, is the king ill? To most, Alfonso XII remained the symbol of Spain's recovery, a monarch forged in restoration, graceful in restraint, youthful enough to carry a tired kingdom forward. But to Maria Christina, he had already begun to vanish, not in abdication or betrayal, but by inches from the inside out. He fought his illness like he fought everything else in his life, with stubbornness and denial. Coughing fits were dismissed as seasonal allergies. Sudden fevers explained away as exhaustion. And when he collapsed briefly behind a curtain after a council meeting in early spring, only his most trusted valet was permitted to help him stand. Maria Christina saw all of it, not because he told her, he never truly did, but because his silences spoke louder than any physician's report ever could. The palace staff, loyal but not blind, began to adjust their patterns. Schedules shifted to allow Alfonso more rest. Speeches were shortened. His horse was replaced with a carriage for long appearances. But the public saw none of this. Alfonso's presence remained unchanged in newspapers and balcony waves. His portrait, replicated endlessly in municipal buildings and schools, carried the same confident gaze and posture. Yet behind those painted eyes, the king was at war with his own body. Maria Christina watched this erosion with the precision of a clockmaker. Every breath taken too shallow, every flicker of pain masked under the royal mask, was a moment etched into her. And yet she said nothing. Not because she lacked care, but because he would not allow it. To confront him would be to confront his mortality. And Alfonso XII had chosen, stubbornly, to live as though death would wait until his son could shake his hand. But the child had not yet come. Maria Christina's pregnancy progressed quietly, the rhythm of her body now entwined with the ticking clock of Alfonso's decline. The court, distracted by political games and diplomatic receptions, spoke often of the future prince. Names were debated. Tutors speculated about lineage. The church offered blessings. But no one could name aloud the shadow hanging over the royal cradle, that the child might be born fatherless, and the crown passed not from king to son, but from widow to infant. During these months, Maria Christina became not just queen, but keeper of the balance between appearance and truth. She attended ceremonies with Alfonso, smiled at nobles she no longer trusted, and greeted foreign envoys with a warmth carefully measured by protocol. Behind the veil of diplomacy, she began expanding her reach, subtly aligning with ministers who favored stability, priests who valued discretion, and generals whose loyalty leaned more toward duty than ideology. She did not move pieces on the board. She became the board. But even as she built a web of quiet influence, Maria Christina remained fundamentally alone. She was surrounded by advisors, watched by courtiers, and adored cautiously by a public beginning to warm to her composure. But her only true companion was time, and time was no friend. In private, Alfonso had moments of clarity, small ruptures in his stoicism when the armor cracked and the boy beneath the crown emerged. On one such night, just after dusk, he invited Maria Christina into his study. The gesture itself was rare. The room, still bearing the faint scent of old cigars and sandalwood, held maps of Spain pinned along the walls. He pointed to them, asked her what she saw. She answered carefully, mentioning rivers, provinces, borders. He shook his head. "No," he whispered more to himself than to her. "What I see is what they will fight over when I am gone." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. In that moment, Maria Christina understood that Alfonso was no longer fighting only disease. He was wrestling with his legacy. Every reform he had pushed, every compromise between conservatives and liberals, every fragile alliance with foreign powers, he now saw them as foundations built on shifting sand. His greatest fear was not death. It was irrelevance. That after him, Spain would collapse again into chaos, and that his reign would become a footnote between republics and pretenders. She didn't offer comfort. That wasn't what he wanted. Instead, she offered presence, her steady, unflinching gaze a mirror to his own uncertainty. That was the closest they ever came to intimacy. Shared dread, shared silence, shared recognition that neither of them had been chosen by love, but both had been chosen by fate. Outside the walls of El Pardo, Spain was restless. The new constitution, signed 2 years earlier, had granted limited liberties while protecting the monarchy's supremacy. It pleased neither the far left nor the far right. The Carlists, beaten but not broken, still dreamed of a Catholic monarchy untouched by liberalism. Republicans, emboldened by their brief taste of power in the 1870s, plotted in cafes and newspapers, waiting for weakness. Alfonso, increasingly absent from daily governance, delegated more and more to his ministers. Some proved competent, others opportunistic. The press began hinting at concerns for the king's health, though no one dared print the word tuberculosis. Maria Christina intercepted foreign correspondences from Vienna, Paris, even Berlin, carefully reading the diplomatic tone beneath the ink. Europe was watching. Spain could not afford another instability. She began rehearsing scenarios in her mind. What if he died before the child was born? What if the child was a girl? What if the Cortes refused her regency? What if the army split again, as it had during the civil wars? Each possibility branched into others, and still she walked through her days like a marble statue, unmoved, unreadable, prepared. The baby stirred within her, a reminder that time had no mercy. As her body grew heavier, so did the demands on her composure. Alfonso began refusing medication. He avoided priests. He refused to be seen lying down. Even in his final public appearance, at a military review in Aranjuez, he stood for nearly an hour, pale as parchment, barely breathing. The crowd cheered. They believed their king strong. Only Maria Christina knew he was crumbling. And then, on a rainless night in November, the collapse came. There was no dramatic fall, no gasping scene, just a slow, quiet unraveling of breath. Alfonso retired to his chamber after dinner, his lips tight, eyes distant. She followed him, not as wife, but as witness. He said nothing, lying beneath the heavy velvet covers. She sat beside him, one hand resting on her swollen abdomen, the other brushing his hair away from his fevered brow. In that final hour, no priest came, no trumpets, no declarations, only Maria Christina. When his chest stopped rising, she did not scream. She did not faint. She whispered a prayer in Latin, pressed her forehead to his cooling hand, and rose. Outside the window, Madrid lay still under moonlight. Within the walls of El Pardo, the King of Spain was dead, and yet the next King of Spain had not yet been born. Maria Christina walked into the hall, summoned the Prime Minister, and uttered the words that would change history. "I will govern in the name of my child, whatever he may be." They asked nothing else of her that night. They knew better. She returned to her chamber, closed the doors, and stood for a long time before the mirror. In it, she saw not a widow. She saw a regent, and behind her eyes she already knew. The real battle, hers, was only just beginning. He died without warning, but Maria Christina had been preparing for his death long before the breath left his body. The palace walls still held the weight of Alfonso's silence, the way his presence had faded like evening light. Now, with his body not yet cold and the weight of a kingdom collapsing onto her shoulders, Maria Christina stood alone, not merely as a widow, but as a vessel between the dead and the unborn, between yesterday and the trembling shape of tomorrow. Outside the palace gates, Spain did not yet know. News traveled on horseback and ink. The official proclamations were still being drafted, the ministers still organizing protocols. But inside El Pardo, where the last Bourbon breath had been exhaled, a quieter truth pulsed. The monarch was gone, and the next was not yet born. Between them, Maria Christina stood like a bridge made of bone and grief. She was 7 months pregnant. The doctors, already cautious before, now swirled around her like anxious ghosts. Every moment of fatigue was analyzed, every tremor of her hands questioned, but she allowed no sentiment, no weakness. She ate quietly, listened intently, slept little. She refused to leave the palace. The child she carried was no longer hers, it was Spain's, and she would not let the nation slip through her fingers, just as Alfonso had. The court, fractured by uncertainty, turned inward. Power, long subdued by Alfonso's reforms, now sought new hands to inhabit. The liberals whispered of Republican experiments. The conservatives argued for a regency council, multiple guardians of the unborn crown. A few dared mention the Carlists again, those embers never fully extinguished. Maria Christina watched it all, said little, and waited. On the third day after Alfonso's death, she summoned the council of ministers. She did not weep. She did not stumble. She walked into the chamber in full mourning attire, draped in black from veil to gloves, and stood at the head of the long mahogany table, where men twice her age had debated constitutional law. When they rose to greet her, she did not nod. She looked each of them in the eye and said simply that she would serve as regent until the birth of the child. And if the child was male, she would continue, not as a placeholder, not as a puppet, but as sovereign in trust. They said nothing for a moment. Then they agreed. It wasn't fear that moved them. It was inevitability. Maria Christina had, in one gesture, robbed them of excuses. There was no weakness in her voice, no indecision, no room for compromise. She did not campaign for power. She absorbed it. From that day forward, she became more than queen. She became structure. But the world outside the palace was not yet ready for structure. It wanted symbols. Across the countryside, villages held dual emotions: grief for the king, hope for the heir. Churches lit candles, farmers offered prayers, nobles hedged their loyalty. In Madrid, black cloth draped every public building. Bells tolled for Alfonso's soul, but even they rang with a kind of hesitation, as if unsure whether to mourn or to wait. Everyone held their breath, waiting to know, would the future be born a boy or a girl? Maria Christina, now moving more slowly, more carefully, took on the full rituals of power. She signed decrees. She met with foreign envoys. She visited the basilica under heavy guard to light a candle, not for Alfonso, but for the child inside her. That act alone was dissected in newspapers across Europe. Some called it bold, some called it blasphemous, but none could deny its meaning. She was already speaking on behalf of a monarch not yet alive. In private, she studied harder than ever. She read state files late into the night, learned the language of military orders, economic ledgers, tax reforms. She traced the maps Alfonso had left behind, absorbing their meaning like scripture. No longer just the wife of a king, she now had to be the mind of the monarchy, the shield and compass of a baby who would either wear the crown or destroy the dynasty by his very gender. And then, on the 27th day of November, the contractions began. The midwives came first, then the doctors, then the archbishop. The chamber was prepared like a chapel and a fortress all at once. Velvet drapes, brass crosses, layers of political silence. Outside the palace, thousands waited. Men clutched their hats. Women whispered rosaries. A monarchy was being born again, not with banners and parades, but with blood, screams, and the fragile hope that biology would rescue an empire. Inside, Maria Christina labored in agony, not for herself, not even for the child. She labored for the country. And when the cry of a newborn split the air, history paused. A boy, Alfonso XIII. The declaration went out at once, by horse, by telegraph, by trumpet. Church bells rang. 100 cannon shots were fired from Madrid's hilltops. Spain erupted in celebration. The Bourbon line had not ended. It had leapt forward, defiant against death. But inside her chamber, Maria Christina did not smile. She held the child with hands that did not tremble and looked into the eyes of a boy who would never know his father. He would never remember the man whose name he carried. He would never hear his voice, never walk behind him into court, never sit beside him at the table of kings. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "You belong to history now." And with that, she became a mother not only to a child, but to a kingdom. The next days were a blur of rituals. The infant king was baptized in gold, his name carved into official decrees, his tiny hand pressed in ink upon the first royal document of his reign. Ministers bowed before him, nobles cried, the church declared it divine continuity. Maria Christina remained still. She wore black, always black, not just for Alfonso, but for the life she had lost in its entirety. She would never again be a woman with a private self. She would now live only as projection of stability, of tradition, of permanence. Behind her quiet face, however, raged a war of questions. What kind of Spain would she hand to this boy? Would the generals remain loyal? Would the people love a king they could not yet see walk? Would the parliament play fair, or begin their games anew once the baby was no longer a novelty? These questions became her obsession, her purpose. She placed a portrait of Alfonso XII on the wall opposite her desk, not for memory, but as a reminder. She would finish what he had started. She would hold together his Spain long enough for his son to inherit something real, something worthy. She did not remarry. She did not retreat. And as she walked the halls of the palace in silence, a child in her arms and a crown hovering above both their heads, the ministers began to understand the truth. They had thought Maria Christina of Austria was a ceremonial queen. They were wrong. She was the monarchy's last defense, and she would protect it, not with speeches, not with soldiers, but with the cold, unflinching, and immovable weight of her silence. There is a moment after the banners are raised and the cannons are fired, when the silence returns. It is the silence of a people still unsure whether they have witnessed a miracle or a delay of fate. And in that silence, Maria Christina stood, not as widow, not as mother, but as something else entirely, a placeholder for power, a living question mark in the shape of a queen. Her son, Alfonso XIII, had been born a king, but he could not speak. He could not walk. He could not sign a decree or give an order. He had no knowledge of borders, no loyalty to factions, no vision of nationhood. He was a symbol, nothing more. And symbols, Maria Christina understood, were both sacred and expendable. If she did not protect the meaning behind his birth, others would rewrite it before he could even form memory. Spain was not stable. It was only exhausted. Decades of war, revolution, monarchy, republic, foreign rulers, coups and counter-coups had left the nation politically shattered and spiritually cynical. The restoration under Alfonso XII had given Spain a brief breath of institutional coherence. But now, with a child on the throne and a woman holding the reins, old ambitions reawakened. The Carlists stirred in the north, whispering that a true king could not come from a liberal constitution. Republican writers filled pamphlets with elegant insults wrapped in poetry. Even within the Bourbon court, whispers arose. Some thought the regency should be shared. Others proposed a council of generals or a male Bourbon cousin to advise the queen. None said it aloud, but all of them asked the same question in private. Can a woman, foreign, widowed, and Catholic, truly rule Spain? Maria Christina answered without rhetoric. She answered with discipline. In her first weeks as regent, she did not overreach. She did not seek to reinvent her husband's policies. She moved within the lines he had drawn. She allowed Parliament to continue its system of alternating power between conservatives and liberals, a delicate dance of appeasement known as turno pacifico. The system was flawed, prone to corruption, and detached from the will of the people. But it offered one priceless commodity: predictability, and that was exactly what she needed. Each week, Maria Christina met with ministers behind closed doors. She listened, absorbed, and remembered. She developed a style of governance that made the men around her forget they were speaking to a queen. She let them speak first. She asked careful questions. She nodded without confirming, delayed without denying, agreed without submitting. Her power was not declared. It was built piece by piece in the spaces where their confidence became arrogance. She was no reformer, but she was a guardian. She knew Spain did not need vision in that moment. It needed time. Time to forget civil war. Time to accept that monarchy, for all its contradictions, offered something republics and generals never had: continuity. Behind palace walls, she kept Alfonso XIII hidden from spectacle. He was not paraded like a sacred relic. Instead, she insisted on privacy, routine, and structure. The child would grow in safety, protected not only from physical harm, but from political performance. When portraits were painted, she insisted they be modest. When stories were printed, she edited the tone. The boy would not become myth. He would become a man, if the nation allowed it. But not all threats were external. Inside the court, ambition fermented like old wine. A former general attempted to leverage his influence over the army to demand a permanent advisory seat beside the queen. When his request was denied, he resigned, and shortly afterward began circulating claims that the monarchy had no support among veterans. Maria Christina responded not with a press conference or public rebuke, but with a single handwritten letter to his successor. Within weeks, the former general's name vanished from conversation. Another noblewoman, once close to the late Queen Mercedes, began holding salons that featured veiled critiques of the regency. At first, Maria Christina ignored them. But when the woman's cousin, a newspaper editor, published an editorial hinting that the regency wears a veil not only of mourning, but of deceit, Maria Christina acted. She ordered a quiet reallocation of government printing contracts away from the cousin's publication. No words were exchanged. Within a month, the salon was closed and the editor moved abroad. These were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of preservation. Maria Christina did not confuse virtue with survival. Her son's throne depended on perception. And perception was a battlefield no less dangerous than Carlist rifles or anarchist bombs. Beyond Madrid, the empire itself trembled. Cuba, still under Spanish rule, had erupted into rebellion again. The cries for independence, once dismissed as distant noise, now echoed in Parliament. Young officers spoke of honor, while economists whispered of cost. The military wanted to crush the uprising. The liberals urged negotiation. Maria Christina listened to both and chose patience. She allowed Parliament to debate. She approved funding for strategic reinforcements without authorizing full-scale war. Her goal was not victory, it was delay. She needed the regency to last until her son could wear the crown himself. And every fire she prevented, every scandal she absorbed, every alliance she tolerated, was one more day earned. The church, initially suspicious of her Austrian Catholicism, grew to admire her piety. She attended Mass without fail, refused to modernize certain religious holidays, and kept a private chapel in the palace. She met with bishops regularly, not to command, but to understand. Over time, they began to see her not as a foreign queen, but as a Spanish mother. That image, carefully nurtured, became her shield. Still, Maria Christina never let herself believe she was secure. Each morning began with letters from the provinces, reports of riots, rumors of coups, shifts in loyalty. Each evening ended with her reading the constitutional texts again, not because she doubted them, but because she understood how fragile their authority truly was. The monarchy was not law, It was belief, and belief could vanish with the right scandal, the wrong headline, the smallest misstep. In moments of solitude, she would walk the palace gardens in full morning dress, her hands folded behind her back, her eyes scanning the hedges like a chessboard. Her ladies-in-waiting kept their distance. Servants moved silently. To outsiders, she appeared cold, distant. But those closest to her knew the truth. She was not distant. She was concentrated. Everything she had once been, daughter, bride, lover, had vanished in the tide of duty. What remained was resolve, shaped by grief, bound by responsibility, and cooled in the fire of national expectation. On the boy's 5th birthday, a small private celebration was held. Just a few courtiers, no press, no fanfare. Maria Christina stood beside her son as he received gifts he could not yet appreciate: miniature thrones, ceremonial swords, leather-bound books of Spanish law. After the guests left, she sat with him in silence. He asked her, with the innocence only a child can possess, if he would be allowed to play outside more when he became king for real. She smiled just enough and whispered, "Only if you remember who was watching." Because Maria Christina knew the truth. The world would never stop watching him, but it would never see her, and that was how it had to be. Power, when held too long in the dark, begins to rot. Maria Christina had known this from the beginning, that her reign was not truly hers, but a borrowed silence between two kings. Yet silence, however noble, invites whispers. And in the 7th year of her regency, the whispers sharpened into knives. Spain had grown tired of waiting. At first it was subtle, invitations rescinded, cabinet ministers shifting tones, old allies suddenly busy. The boy king, now 7, had begun to appear more frequently in public, smiling from balconies, learning the etiquette of handshakes, reciting carefully rehearsed lines to visiting dignitaries. The people adored him. His youth was a balm to their fatigue. His bloodline a comfort against the fever of republicanism. But behind closed doors, those who had once bent their knees to Maria Christina began questioning how long a queen in mourning could command the illusion of permanence. In the salons of Madrid, among porcelain cups and cigar smoke, the word transition returned. Not openly, not as decree, but as murmur. Shouldn't a council be formed? Shouldn't the young king be groomed more aggressively? Shouldn't the regency begin to loosen its grip? Maria Christina heard every murmur. She had learned in the years since Alfonso's death to listen more carefully to what was not said. Her ministers, respectful on paper, grew increasingly bold in private. They offered advice as mandates. They requested audiences not with her, but with the prince. They published editorials praising the Queen Mother for her service, a word used only for those being quietly dismissed. She responded not with outrage, but with calculation. She called fewer meetings, but made each one heavier. She spoke less in council, but issued more memoranda. She allowed the boy to appear more publicly, but never alone. He sat beside her, his back straight, his face carefully neutral. She taught him how to nod at the right moment without agreeing, how to speak without committing, how to rule without revealing. At night, she instructed his tutors in private, ensuring that every page of his education was a continuation of her governance. But control invites resentment. One afternoon, a portfolio of royal expenditures appeared in a newspaper sympathetic to the liberals. The numbers were exaggerated, but they portrayed the palace as extravagant, aloof, wasteful. The public outcry was mild, but the intention was clear: to weaken the moral image of the regency. A week later, a military officer was arrested for publishing a pamphlet accusing the queen of manipulating the boy king to extend her own power. Though the accusation was baseless, the damage lingered. She summoned no investigators, there were no purges. She simply stopped returning certain calls. But the shadows deepened. Her closest ally in the Interior Ministry, an old, soft-spoken bureaucrat who had once served her husband, was implicated in a land scandal. Documents were leaked. Witnesses coerced. Whether he was guilty or not, she would never know. But the scandal swept him away in days. The opposition framed it as a failure of oversight. The church remained silent. Even her most loyal newspapers began to print headlines in smaller fonts. She felt the architecture of her regency tremble. That same month, a letter arrived from Vienna. Her brother, now a senior official in the Habsburg court, warned her that Spain's foreign diplomats had begun referring to the regency as a window of fragility. One ambassador in private had asked whether Austria would accept the Queen's return should the Spanish monarchy collapse. It was not a question, it was a warning. Maria Christina did not reply. Instead, she turned inward. She shortened her public appearances, reduced her staff, dismissed 3 advisors without explanation. She spent long nights in her private chapel, sometimes in silence, sometimes weeping. Alone, unobserved, unwitnessed. Her faith, once a shield, now became a place of refuge. The God she prayed to did not promise triumph, only endurance. And then, the whispers turned to threats. One morning, as she prepared to leave for Mass, her headmaid discovered a note pinned to the hem of her veil. It bore no name, just a sentence. "Your mourning will never end." The handwriting was elegant. She said nothing to the court, but from that day forward her security detail doubled. Windows were inspected, kitchens were watched, letters were read. Even the boy was not exempt. His play areas narrowed, his tutors vetted again. His smile grew thinner, his laughter more rehearsed. He asked once if something had happened. She told him no. He believed her, but only because he wanted to. The Queen Regent had become a prisoner of the very stability she had built. Every success of her governance had made her more dispensable. The smoother the transition looked, the more impatient her enemies became. She had been too competent for too long, and now the game of shadows sought to write her out before the spotlight could shift to someone else. And yet she did not yield. Because power, Maria Christina understood, was not about being visible. It was about being unavoidable. She began placing loyalists in the second and third layers of government, permanent secretaries, archivists, deputy treasurers. She encouraged reforms in municipal education, not to shape opinion, but to shape memory. She funded Catholic charities in poor districts, not out of piety, but to ensure that the church remained tethered to her image. And when she met with foreign envoys, she always brought the boy. Always. But the pressure wore her thin. She began to cough in the mornings. Her hands trembled during prayer. Her handwriting grew uneven. She refused doctors. She refused questions. She refused sympathy. One evening, as the sun set behind the palace and the boy read aloud from a history book, she interrupted him. She asked, "Do you know what they remember about queens?" He looked up, startled, unsure how to answer. She said nothing more, because the truth was too cruel to speak. They remembered nothing, and she would leave nothing for them to distort. Just a throne, just a boy, just a silence that refused to die. She had spent 17 years holding Spain together with silence and precision. 17 years weaving a tapestry of political survival, stitched with diplomacy, discipline, and denial. And now, with her hands finally beginning to tremble, and the palace corridors whispering the word transition more boldly than ever before, Maria Christina stood at the edge of the one act she had both feared and prepared for. Letting go. The boy was no longer a boy. Alfonso XIII, born a king, had grown into a prince of restless ambition, tall, charming, with the Bourbon sharpness in his eyes and the Austrian rigidity in his spine. He walked through the halls of Madrid like he already ruled. The ministers laughed at his jokes. The generals bowed deeper than necessary. The press photographed him as if history had already been written. To the people, he was a symbol of youth restored, a king untouched by the past, unburdened by the scars of war or ideology. To Maria Christina, he was a paradox. She had raised him to command but taught him to listen. She had trained him in caution but seen in him the fire of impulse. Every tutor she had appointed, every script he had read before stepping onto a balcony, every ceremonial step rehearsed a dozen times before the public saw it, she had orchestrated all of it. But now he wanted more than choreography, he wanted control. And she wasn't sure he was ready. The danger wasn't that he was weak, it was that he was strong in the wrong directions. He questioned policies not because he understood them, but because he was bored. He flirted with absolutist ideas, spoke admiringly of monarchs who had ruled without parliament. He read military dispatches with too much enthusiasm. The boy who once repeated her Latin prayers now studied maps of colonial campaigns with the gleam of conquest in his eye. Maria Christina watched him carefully. She did not scold. She did not intervene. She observed, measured, compared, calculated. And what she saw unsettled her more than any rebellion, more than any scandal, more than any political threat. She saw herself in him, not the reserved, veiled queen of mourning, but the young archduchess she had once been in Vienna. Headstrong, proud, ambitious beneath the quiet. Except where she had learned restraint through sacrifice, Alfonso had learned performance through privilege. He had never known loss, never known defeat, never been ignored, and she feared what a man like that would do with power he had not yet earned. The court, of course, was eager. The regency, they whispered, had gone on long enough. Foreign observers praised the Queen's service, but framed it in the past tense. The French ambassador asked pointedly when the king would begin his proper reign. The British press published an editorial describing Maria Christina as a candle slowly dimming beneath the Spanish sun. The Vatican, though still respectful, encouraged transition with gentle firmness. She had always known this moment would come, and so she began to prepare. First, she arranged private meetings between Alfonso and select ministers, those who would remain after her departure. She taught him not just how to command a room, but how to read one. She made him sit through hours of reports without speaking, forced him to listen to farmers' complaints, military grievances, and budgetary audits without comment. She told him quietly that the first mistake of kings is assuming they are interesting. Then came the public transition. He presided over small ceremonies, gave short speeches, opened a school in Seville, visited veterans in Valencia. Each appearance was carefully curated, enough visibility to suggest maturity, but always with her presence nearby, not looming, but unignorable. Behind closed doors, she tested him. She gave him mock councils, role-playing sessions where he had to mediate between opposing factions. She gave him contradictory reports and watched which he believed. She offered him choices with no right answers and saw how he justified them. Each night she took notes. Each morning she adjusted. And then came the question she could not delay. When would she relinquish power? The Constitution allowed her discretion. The boy was of age by law. The press was impatient. Parliament was expectant. But Maria Christina hesitated. Not because she craved power. She had never desired it. Power had been her penance, not her prize. She hesitated because she feared he would waste it, that all she had preserved, the fragile equilibrium between church and state, between liberals and conservatives, between monarchy and the people, would be shattered by his certainty. And yet she could not stay forever. A regency prolonged becomes a prison for the regent and for the nation. So, in the spring of 1902, she summoned her lawyers and began the legal process. The announcement was made quietly at first, then with ceremony. A date was set. Alfonso would formally assume full royal powers in May. The newspapers erupted with celebration. The court buzzed. Foreign kings sent congratulations. The boy smiled for photographs, rehearsed his speech, and practiced his signature on parchment older than his father's grave. Maria Christina watched it all with the calm of a woman who had nothing left to fear and nothing left to control. On the morning of the transfer, she dressed in the same shade of black she had worn since 1885, her veil lighter now, her posture just as straight. She walked beside her son into the Cortes building, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm, not as queen, not as ruler, but as mother. The ceremony was short. Applause echoed through marble walls. The anthem played. He signed, he rose, and she stepped back. There was no final address, no farewell, no declaration of gratitude. She had not come to be remembered. She had come to hold the crown until it could be safely worn. And now it was no longer hers. That evening, in the quiet of her private study, she opened a small wooden drawer and retrieved a letter. It was one she had written the day Alfonso XIII was born, addressed to herself. Sealed, never opened. She broke the seal. The ink had faded. The handwriting was shaky. It said only one thing: raise him for Spain, not for yourself. She folded the paper, burned it, closed the drawer. Outside, fireworks painted the night sky. Crowds chanted his name. But within the palace, Maria Christina sat alone, hands in her lap, and whispered a prayer, not for him, but for the country that had once accepted her silence as strength. Because the boy was king now, and she had given him everything, even the right to ruin it all. The crown no longer needed her. After the ceremonies, after the last applause faded into marble halls, after her son kissed her cheek with a smile that belonged more to the photographers than to her, Maria Christina withdrew. Not with bitterness, but with a quiet dignity too deep to notice. She did not retire. Queens do not retire. She receded as fog does at dawn, not because it is defeated, but because it is no longer needed. She moved her residence to the quieter wings of the palace, further from the offices of state, further from the voices that now called for Alfonso instead of her. Her days grew slower, her presence less frequent. She attended mass with smaller retinues. She ate alone. The advisors she had once molded now addressed their reports to the young king, and he, for his part, seemed grateful. Grateful, but distant. The boy she had raised to carry Spain had become a man too eager to rewrite it. Alfonso XIII ruled with energy. He traveled the provinces, visited troops, reinforced colonial campaigns. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never known exile, never felt the weight of burial clothes beneath a crown. He was adored at first. The newspapers that once featured Maria Christina in careful portraits now celebrated his charisma, his modernity, his appetite for reform and glory. He made promises quickly. He changed ministers often. He dabbled in military strategy, foreign diplomacy, even the aesthetics of the monarchy itself. The crown under his hands gleamed brighter than ever, but its metal was thinner, and Maria Christina watched it all. She did not interfere. She did not criticize. But she saw. She saw him ignore the fragile compromise between left and right that she had preserved like sacred glass. She saw him overstep constitutional boundaries in pursuit of swift victories. She saw him believe that affection was loyalty and that popularity was permanence. She saw, in short, what she had feared most, that he would break what she had only just managed to hold together. In her final years, Maria Christina walked the gardens of the palace as she had in the earliest days of her regency, alone, always in black, always with gloved hands clasped behind her back. The younger servants whispered that she was a relic. The newer ministers avoided her gaze. She no longer signed laws, no longer shaped alliances, no longer mattered. And still she watched. On her 65th birthday, Alfonso gifted her a gold-framed portrait of himself on horseback, leading troops in North Africa. He had written a note inside the package, "For the one who gave me the strength to lead." She read it once, folded it, placed it inside her prayer book. She knew it was meant as love, but it felt like an elegy. Because by then, the cracks had begun to show. Spain's colonies crumbled one by one. Cuba lost. The Philippines lost. Morocco, bleeding. Discontent swelled in factories and farmlands alike. The liberals turned hostile. The conservatives suspicious. The church murmured. The army fumed. And the king, untested by true hardship, began to lash out. Not in fury, but in confusion. He tried to repair what he did not understand, and each move made the next one harder to justify. Maria Christina offered no counsel. He did not ask. And even if he had, she might not have answered, because she had already learned the final lesson of monarchy. Power does not die. It drifts, and then it is rewritten. The palace she once ruled now bore her portrait in a lesser hallway. Her letters, once royal decrees, were boxed and forgotten. Her sacrifices, untold, uncelebrated, became stories told only in the private recollections of priests and aging archivists. When her health began to fail, the newspapers offered polite tributes, but few remembered the 17 years she had carried the kingdom on her shoulders. They spoke of Alfonso's reign as revival, as energy, as boldness. Her name faded from print, her presence from memory. She died in 1929. No national day of mourning, no grand procession, just a funeral mass in Madrid, attended by diplomats and nobles who had already begun preparing for the king's next crisis. Spain had moved on, but she, in her own way, had expected this, because queens who reign in silence are rarely remembered in song. They are not cast in bronze. They are not etched in anthem. They become the bones of nations, unseen, unpraised, but vital. A year after her death, the monarchy collapsed. Alfonso XIII, her son, fled into exile. The throne she had guarded for a lifetime vanished within a season. And in that final twist, history revealed its cruelest truth, that Maria Christina had not only outlived a king and raised another, she had outlived a dynasty. But not because she failed, because she had succeeded too quietly. And in Spain, as in all empires, it is the noise that history remembers,